But now, our third example of the voice of our fine shepherd is at Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to read verses 19 and 20. Stop storing up for yourselves treasures on the earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. Rather, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. We're told that our focus should be on spiritual things and not on physical things. And this is especially true when thinking about where we are in the stream of time, in the final part of the final part of the last days. But what's the voice of strangers of this world on this subject? Exert yourself vigorously to acquire material possessions. Pursue things that will make your life comfortable, because that is what will bring you happiness. The question is, to whom are we listening? Jehovah and Jesus tell us to be content now with a spiritual paradise, and to concentrate on our life-saving preaching work, and that they will provide a physical paradise later.
We're watching Stephen Lett taking us through the September JW Broadcasting episode, and now he's talking to us about materialism. Stephen Lett really doesn't like the idea of people making themselves comfortable in Satan's system of things, and he feels that the world around us is geared towards making people chase money. I guess you could say there's an argument for that, but the reality is that there are many who don't chase money, irrespective of what advertising they watch or the way certain people live their lives. Manifestly, it's the case that some people are more materialistic than others, irrespective of religion. I think that's self-evident. I think we all intuitively know this, but that's not how Stephen Lett wants us to think about materialism. Stephen Lett wants us to think that we're being told, exert yourself vigorously to acquire material possessions.
But what's the voice of strangers of this world on this subject? Exert yourself vigorously to acquire material possessions. Pursue things that will make your life comfortable, because that is what will bring you happiness.
If you say so, I guess, but I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing it. I think some people are and always will be materialistic, and some people are not. But what we have here is just another sweeping generalization, a great example of black and white ideology. Our organization says this, Satan's world says something different. There can be no nuance, there can be no provision for people in Satan's world having different ideas on the issue of materialism. We'll come back to materialism because Stephen Lett has more to say on this, and the more he talks about it, the more he demonstrates himself to be a total hypocrite, as I'm going to come to. But I do just want to revisit Stephen Lett's remarkable doubling down on his rhetoric about the last days.
And this is especially true when thinking about where we are in the stream of time, in the final part of the final part of the last days. So the events unfolding around us are making clearer than ever that we're living in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
Isn't it interesting that we've been in the final part of the last days already for 2 years now? This was when Stephen Lett first coined that phrase. The final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days. It was probably the most notable example of the Jehovah's Witness organization leaping on the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to spread fear-mongering and doomsday ideas that the apocalypse is coming, the end is nigh. You'd think Stephen Lett would be embarrassed about this. Anyone with any kind of self-awareness would be thinking, God, I can't believe I got so carried away. Because the rhetoric back then was implying that this is it. You know, we're right at the end now because there's a pandemic. Only 2 years on, more than 2 years on, the situation is changed. We're still in the pandemic, but life-saving medicine has been developed. Precautions have been implemented. In many countries, those precautions have been rolled back, but nonetheless, humanity has risen to the challenge of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic to the point where even Stephen Lett and his organization have been promoting the vaccine that has been developed by worldly scientists. And yet, Stephen Lett's apparently still proud of his jumping up and down at the outset of the pandemic, claiming that here we are in the final part of the last days. The phrase last days, those words become more and more meaningless, don't they? The more this organization claims to be right at the end of the last days, or in the final part of the last days, and the more it does this over not just months or years, but decades, all the way through its history, if you go back in the literature, the more the term last days gets diluted to the point where it's practically meaningless.
1 Peter 2:11 indicates that we should view ourselves as temporary residents who are just passing through this old system and headed for the real life in the new world. What do we mean by temporary resident? Well, imagine that you rent an old house to live in while a new, beautiful house is being built for you. You'll live there only a few months. Would you install a new concrete driveway? Would you put in new electrical wiring and plumbing? Would you install brand new vinyl siding? No. You might do a few cosmetic things to make your stay a little more comfortable, but you wouldn't do anything major. Why? Because you know you're just a temporary resident and that soon you'll move into your beautiful new home. Well, if we think of ourselves just as temporary residents in this old system, it'll be a real protection against the materialism that is promoted by the voice of strangers.
Stephen Lett there talking about the need to be temporary residents or view ourselves as temporary residents as it relates to materialism. We shouldn't get too involved in Satan's system of things, in making our lives comfortable in Satan's system of things, because it's all just temporary. We should be working towards God's new system and furthering kingdom interests instead of making our lives comfortable in the here and now. That's the message. And again, Stephen Lett is being a total hypocrite here. You may remember earlier in this broadcast, Stephen Lett alluded to having a brother.
As little boys, my brother and I would pet the goats that my grandfather had. But if we turned our backs on them, one would often sneak up behind us and butt us for no reason.
So Stephen Lett has a brother, and I can reveal his brother's name is Timothy. Here, if Tibor is gracious, is a picture of Timothy Lett. And we can go one better if you like. We can actually see news footage of Stephen Lett's brother Timothy, because as it happens, Timothy was on the news back in, I think, 2019, when his restaurant got engulfed in a fire.
It was here for a while. You know, I worked on it for 18 years, and it was about 2 years people got to enjoy it. I had a campaign poster in there of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he ran for president. You know, there was a bronze cannon, and we're still looking for it, because I can't believe the bronze cannon melted. I'm a pretty old guy, you know. Anybody need 2 acres of ground, you know, come see me. That's what I say.
So that was Timothy Lett reacting to the fire that unfortunately ravaged his restaurant business. You might be wondering why I'm talking about Stephen's brother Timothy. It's because of a discovery that was made, actually not on this channel, but on the Blue Envelope channel. A thumbnail will appear, if Tibor is gracious, to a video from that channel, which brought our attention to details of a financial transaction involving Stephen and Timothy Lett. They invested in property together, and there are documents to prove this. So if Tibor is gracious, you will also see a document from 2013, State of Alabama, County of Baldwin, Vendor's Lien Deed. If you scroll down, you'll perhaps see a figure quoted of $500,000. And you'll also see the names Timothy R. Lett and Mark Stephen Lett, along with his wife, Susan Lynn Lett. So this is a property transaction where Stephen and his wife, Susan, have gone in halves on a $500,000 property. So $250,000 on Timothy's side, or Tim's side, and $250,000 on Stephen and Susan's side. You can see there the location of the property is lots 1 and 2, Lagoon Park, in Baldwin County, Alabama. This is a waterfront property. It's an investment property. And the document goes on to stipulate all the whys and wherefores of the transaction. But essentially, this is documented, signed, notarized evidence that Stephen Lett, with his wife Susan, are involved in the property market. Now, there's nothing wrong with being involved in the property market. There's nothing wrong in investing in property. Where I have a problem is the hypocrisy of moralizing about materialism and this idea of being temporary residents while you are personally acting to the contrary, because you are making yourself comfortable. You are investing in property for the long term. If Stephen Lett really, really considers these to be the last days, or the final part of the final part of the last day of the last days, whatever, what's he doing investing in property in Satan's system of things? And furthermore, where does this put him in relation to the vow of poverty? If all of this sounds familiar, it may be because I've already touched on this. I did a sushi on the hypocrisy of Stephen Lett when it comes to materialism, because this isn't the only occasion on which Stephen Lett has been moralizing on the issue of materialism. It seems to be one of his pet subjects, telling followers not to be materialistic. But in this sushi video, I explain that there is such a thing as the vow of poverty. When you're a governing body member, you're a Bethelite. And when you're a Bethelite, you are a member of the worldwide order of special full-time servants of Jehovah's Witnesses. This worldwide order has a list of rules, and one of those rules is that when you're in this worldwide order, you're not allowed to receive an income. You effectively make a vow of poverty. You're not allowed to receive money while being in the worldwide order. The only exception is in cases where the order itself exempts someone in a particular case. So effectively, the heads of the worldwide order get to decide if they want to make an exception. And who are the heads of the worldwide order? Well, it's safe to say, I think, that the governing body are right up there, aren't they? When it comes to deciding whether any exceptions should be made. So it seems, or it looks like, Stephen Lett gets a free pass when it comes to making real estate investments while making this vow of poverty. So there's hypocrisy there. There's hypocrisy in him telling millions of Jehovah's Witnesses, many of whom can barely afford to put food on the table, many of whom can barely afford to have a roof over their heads. And he's telling them to not be materialistic. He's telling them to live as temporary residents while he's going in halves on a $500,000 property. I'm sure there are many things Stephen Lett is in a position to lecture us on, but given his personal track record, I'm sorry, materialism just isn't one of them.